Hey guys, Chris here with the East Troy Computer Club. Just me. This is all you get. Ben is busy, but I did want to get a podcast out. This one's about APIs, and I just wanted to explain what they are, just the real basics of it, get some resources to you guys about how to build APIs or how to consume them, and kind of see where the conversation goes from there. So I hope you stick around and enjoy. So, what are APIs? That question came from my wife when she was reviewing the YouTube video of the Excel talk. And then I told her, well, an API stands for Application Programming Interface, of course. And she looked at me and I could tell that she had about 10 more questions for me that I wasn't prepared to answer. I did a deep dive myself into APIs and tried to figure out what a good analogy was for it. And a couple of them came to me. And that's kind of where I want to start this conversation. And then we'll do a deep dive into what makes a good API and what type of APIs are out there. So in technology, when there's an acronym that doesn't make sense and you explain it as application programming interface, and then that doesn't make sense to someone, usually it helps to just pick one word and break it down from there. And that's where it kind of led me to an analogy. When I picked the word interface, everyone knows what application programming is, but what's an interface? And an interface is just a way to connect two independent systems or sometimes unrelated systems together. So a way to connect those. And an analogy that I came up with was you write out a letter and put it in the mail. A postman or woman picks that letter up and then sends it to the destination. In between there, though, they go to the post office, put it in for processing, and it connects that letter, if you think of that as your application, connects to a lot of other systems that are related to getting the letter all the way to the to your friend or whatever. That letter has to go through a postman that has to carry it to the post office, and then that post office has to transmit it over to the other post office that goes to the postman and then finally gets to your friend. All of that stuff happens behind the scenes, and that's my best explanation for an API. All the stuff that's happening behind the scenes is the API, and all those connections are different APIs. So there's many forms of APIs, such as like operating system level APIs for performing OS related tasks, database APIs, hardware APIs, software libraries. Those are all considered APIs as well. I'm going to focus on web-based APIs because that's like 90% of the world, at least my world that I work in. So it's the one I'm most familiar with. Web APIs can do anything. They could store users for you if you don't want your application to handle users. They can look up data for you. So if you wanted to see what the weather was, you could use like AccuWeather's web API to pull weather forecasts down. Those are all examples, real life examples of web APIs. Web APIs, well, even other APIs, but specifically web APIs came about, I want to say with like XML and SOAP, and they run on HTTP requests. So they send down an XML, JSON, or SOAP message through REST. And again, I'm saying a lot of terms. I'm not going to get into those. I'll probably post them in the show notes. But they send a message to a web server that responds. That message typically has to be authenticated. There are some APIs that are open where you don't need authentication. But for doing things like managing users, you're going to need authentication. If you're creating an API, you're probably going to need authentication on some level of it. So the design of the API is very specific to what that API purpose is. So when you're looking at connecting with some of these different services that are out there on the web, what you'll want to look for or Google for is a REST API, R-E-S-T API. And that REST API will define how you connect up with their service, how you authenticate with it, and the different calls to make. So again, in our user example, if you needed to create a user, you might be actually doing a post method to their REST API, and the endpoint might have a /user endpoint. And then in your body of your post, you're going to have all the data there. Once that API authenticates you, validates the data, it'll return a 200 OK through through the protocol. So it'll return a 200 response, and then it'll also probably return the body of the user or the user that you created back in the response. So going back to our letter writing analogy, if you fill out a credit card application, send it in the mail, you're going to get a letter back saying you got approved, here's your credit card, or you got denied. Kind of the same thing will happen on REST API. You're either your user is valid and it was created, here's the information on your user, or it's not valid, it was denied, and this is what you need to fix. Okay, and what makes a good API? So I've done a lot of integrations with like Stripe.com, PayPal, a lot of e-commerce integrations. So a lot of things to do with shipping and everything like that. One of the better APIs I've worked with recently is Stripe, and the reason why Stripe is a good API, and for those that don't know, Stripe does credit card processing, so you can basically send it all the credit card information. You don't have to store it on your end. It does the processing for you, and it's similar to PayPal. The reason why I like Stripe's API is because it's very well documented. There's examples, oodles and oodles of examples out there on how to do something. It has a test API to it, so if you wanted to test out if a credit card is going to work or get declined on your website before you even launch it, you can run those tests. That makes a good API. What makes a bad API is kind of the opposite. So if it doesn't have examples, you're kind of left shooting in the dark. If it doesn't have a test server, man, good luck running that on production. You're going to have to work with a developer to make sure that the production data doesn't get dirtied up or anything like that. So an example of a bad API would be, in my opinion, I would say Amazon, because Amazon is very, the documentation isn't accurate. So if you look at how to integrate with Amazon for pulling, again, e-commerce orders, their documentation is not accurate. A lot of times it's going to be wrong. So it'll tell you how to do it, saying to put in these values. And then once it returns back, it's gonna give you an error saying, yeah, those values aren't valid. You have to change them. Look at our documentation. So that's a little frustrating because, you were looking at the documentation, then you have to email and wait for a response. That's what makes a bad API. Speaking on APIs and the design a bit, and I know this is we kind of jumped in, but that's why it's called a deep dive. So speaking on what makes good APIs, there are programs and utilities out there to help you build a good API. One of them for building out good APIs that I always use, I always actually look at schema.org first before building out an API, because that defines how your data should be structured. And schema.org is put on by Google, Yahoo, Microsoft. All the big players are contributing to how data should look, such as users, things, just everything, and events. So if you look at how your data should be stored, you're going to get a good idea on how to represent your data when there's an API call made. So let's say we're creating an API for, let's just say shipping. And that shipping API needs to hold orders. Well, on schema.org, I would look for something similar to like what an e-commerce order would look like. And I would just draw inspiration from there. Obviously, it's going to be unique to the customer that we're creating this API for. But once that API is designed, I would then start documenting out how does this data relate to each other and how are we going to access this data. And that's where I would start looking at REST API examples. When looking at REST API examples, you're going to see that a lot of people start by designing what the resources are going to be. And what that means is the URIs or the URL structure. For our order example, it would be /orders. And then also noting down what verbs or operations we want to do with them. So in programming, there's a term called CRUD, which stands for create, read, update, and delete. And we would designate the objects that we're going to be interacting with, like orders. And then we're going to designate what we're going to do with those objects. So we want to create an order. We want to read an order. So when we're fetching an order, we want to update an order if someone's information changes, and we want to be able to delete that order. So once we determine what those endpoints are, we can start building out what those representations of that data is and start associating it with it. So for example, /orders maybe pulls down a list of all the orders in the system. However, if we send /orders with a /ID or the identifier of the order, maybe we get just one order back. And then if we post to /orders using the post method, we would create an order. If we use the put method for /orders, we would then update a specific order with that specified ID. I get that I'm doing a deep dive into APIs. That is the title of the podcast, but I am going to be posting show notes for beginners, intermediates, and advanced people to do their own research, because we can't possibly cover everything in a little 10-15 minute podcast. But the beginner side of the show notes is going to be just the basics about APIs and real world examples of what APIs are. Intermediate is going to be how to create one yourself, or how to understand like the methods that are available. Advanced will be the different tools that I use and the differences between like authorization and authentication when it comes to APIs. Okay. Well, now that you know everything there is to know about APIs, yeah, that's not true. You probably have more questions than you do have answers. But that's kind of how technology works. It leaves you interested in learning more. Tell you what though, next Thursday I'm going to be at the Computer Club meeting at our new space at Michael Fields. You can ask me any question you want about APIs, and I will try my best to answer them. Specific questions are always welcome. Podcasts are try to be a catch-all for everyone that's interested. So it's September 5th, next Thursday. We're going to be talking about technology at Michael Fields. It starts at 7 p.m. It's going to go till about 8:30, 9 o'clock. Michael Fields is right off of Town Line Road. You can Google it. You can find us on the Facebook page. And we hope to have you guys there. This one is going to be more talking about what the Computer Club is about. So it's going to be great if you're a newcomer. Come to this meetup and attend. If you're experienced, come to this meetup and welcome newcomers. We want to get the word out and get people excited about networking and meeting other people and learning about technology in a cool way. So hope to see you guys there. Keep tinkering.